On June the 4th, 2019, Hyperkin announced the Ultra Retron, an HDMI-based Nintendo 64 clone console. Now, as you guys know, when something like this comes out, I tend to get excited about it, and I did a technical deep dive into the world of Nintendo 64 emulation, and I'm here to tell you what I think realistically you should expect from a system like the Ultra Retron and any additional clone Nintendo 64 consoles that get released. So here we go, the Nintendo 64 clones are coming. Hyperkin just announced the Ultra Retron, a Nintendo 64 for modern TVs with HDMI. This is likely to be the first of many clones, and I expect at least one or two more possible Nintendo 64 clones to be announced before the holiday season. It's the next obvious iteration, and Hyperkin have been teasing a product like this for some time now. You may remember this infamous image of some handheld device that was teased. That led to nothing, but the idea has clearly been in Hyperkin's mind for some time. The Ultra Retron plays original Nintendo 64 cartridges over HDMI. It has 4 controller ports and is fully compatible with original Nintendo 64 gamepads. The system will come bundled with a Hyperkin branded aftermarket controller for instant action. Taking a look at the teaser of the product, it looks promising, and it certainly got my attention. They showed some gameplay of Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye, and Super Smash Bros. It looks good connected up to a modern HD TV via HDMI. I like the look of the unit and initial impressions are good. Performance seemed on point as well. Now, for those people that are wondering why a modern Nintendo 64 system is desirable, it's simply because the original hardware hasn't aged particularly well. Getting a good image out of one can be cost prohibitive. HDMI modding a Nintendo 64 can be an option, but it's also very expensive. You could also use a RetroTink or a FrameMeister, but there's additional costs associated here too, and you're still not getting HDMI out. So the point of this video is to give you some information about what I think the Hyperkin Ultra Retron will be. And of course, you can choose to do whatever you want with this information, but as someone who has experience in Nintendo 64 emulation in the past, here's what I know. So last night on my Twitter feed, someone sent me a screenshot. This person had an eagle eye, and if you look closely, the Jumbotron above the tunnel in Mario Kart 64 is corrupted. This is what it should look like. So just from this, we know that an emulator is being used. This part is obvious, but we are ruling out any type of FPGA or some type of hybrid approach where real hardware chips are being used. It turns out the emulator in question is Mupen 64 Plus-Next, which is an open source Nintendo 64 emulator that runs on many devices, including Windows PCs, phones, tablets, the Nintendo Switch, and even the PlayStation Classic have ports. The first thing to note, Mupen 64 Plus is GPL open source, actually utilizing the GPL3 license, which means the emulator can be sold commercially, so Hyperkin are well within their rights to do so. They are, however, supposed to supply source code with the product if any derivative work was done. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and the GPL3 license is full of legal jargon, but I do believe they are in their rights to sell this product. Will they bundle the source code with their product? Probably not, but they are certainly not pulling a Koch Media / Capcom and using a non-commercial product. Now, some of you may be wondering, how do you know it's Mupen 64 Plus-Next? The answer to that is because this issue is reproducible in the emulator on a PC. If I use these settings, the exact issue shows up, and this was confirmed to me by the LibRetro team themselves. This Jumbotron glitch illustrates a challenge with Nintendo 64 emulation that's been around since the very first release of Ultra HLE and Project 64 back in the 90s. And this challenge is known as frame buffer emulation. To explain this further, the Nintendo 64 GPU, known as the RDP or Reality Display Processor, and the CPU share the same RAM. In many Nintendo 64 games, there are effects like motion blur, fisheye effects, and many others. Rendering to a texture like the Jumbotron in Mario Kart 64 is the result of the CPU manipulating the frame and telling the RDP to render it, on top of the current frame being rendered. On a real 64, this is fast because both the processors share the same RAM. On anything else, there is a cost associated. When we look at emulating the Nintendo 64, if we think about a PC in order to emulate some of the same graphical effects, some of them can be done quite easily with modern graphics cards in hardware such as motion blur and shader effects, with not much overhead. But others that manipulate the frame buffer like the Jumbotron would require a copy of the current buffer on screen into the system RAM, then the CPU needs to manipulate it, then it gets copied back into VRAM. This on top of the existing GPU pipeline, as you can imagine, becomes an extremely slow process. Now I say extremely slow process, but on modern PCs and hardware, you'll barely notice it because today's processors are fast, yet you still may see the occasional stuttering here and there, and this is one byproduct of Nintendo 64 emulation. But what about on a cheap, ARM-based system on a chip that has, let's say, a 1.6 GHz processor and a 600 MHz GPU? That's where frame buffer emulation becomes a challenge. On slower processors, the cost associated with emulating this effect is significant, and in many instances it may make sense to disable it in order to keep the performance where it needs to be. Hyperkin knows in order for this product to be a hit with consumers, it needs to run at good speeds. In order to do this, some sacrifices to the frame buffer emulation need to be made. Hence, the glitch that we see in Mario Kart 64. Now this may not be a big deal to some people. In hell, even I missed it, but when you start disabling frame buffer emulation, you start to run into compatibility issues. Here is a few random games that I thought about that will most likely not run very well and possess graphical glitches. There are many games in the Nintendo 64's complete library that use frame buffer effects like this. Now I'm not saying all of them will be affected, but it will certainly drop compatibility. As far as the specifications of the Ultra Retron go, I would expect it to have similar specs to that of the PlayStation Classic. In other words, a 1.5 GHz processor and a 600 MHz GPU with about 1 GB of RAM. So if you've used Mupen Plus on that system, I would expect a similar level of performance. The last thing that I can tell you, and people were asking about this, are EverDrive cartridges. I can pretty much guarantee that they will not be supported by this unit. Given the nature of Nintendo 64 emulation itself, this is highly unlikely. But it's not all bad news. This product for what it is looks good as long as the price is set appropriately. It won't run everything, and in fact I'd put compatibility levels at around 85%. So be prepared for some level of inconsistencies and glitching. The well-known classic Nintendo 64 games will run well, and maybe that's what most people are looking for here, but there are many cases of games that just won't run properly or glitch out, and I want people to have realistic expectations about this product. Hyperkin will be at E3 next week, and I will be at E3 as well next week, so I'll definitely stop by the Hyperkin booth and check out the Ultra Retron firsthand. And if there's any new information that I can present that I did not mention in this video, or if there's any kind of differing information, I'll be sure to present it to you guys, because I really want you guys to be realistic and understand what this product is and what it is not. I think it's very much a system that has a lot of hype around it, and I just want to set some realistic expectations about what you're probably going to get when you purchase a unit like this in reality. Well, that will do it for this video, guys. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye for now.